We had quite some specific questions to both of the speakers, so it'd be nice if we can sort of generally ask questions about modelling that we might open up a broader discussion. And actually, Adam's questions are quite a good place to start. I particularly like this question about how we define what an appropriate model is and what appropriate complexity is. So fire away, please, folks. Yeah. Yeah, the gaps. You can talk about the gaps, but I'm not going to start with the question.
I'm not going to ask about the gaps.
There are so many questions coming from the audience. I'm not going to bother with one for me.
I just thought there would be an interesting contrast in the two of you trying to present your results to a stakeholder from DEFRA or the NFU or whatever. And who would be the winner? Because yours look beautiful, but incomprehensibly complex with layers that are hidden from those people, and yours are beautifully simple in arbitrary units with just two colours. And I can see the truth and value in both of those, but how does that get... Who wins in a fight between the two of you with DEFRA?
Harry Hill thing. Fight.
A gentle fight.
I worry we'd both lose. I guess we would both present differently to DEFRA. Yeah, that's probably an open question, how you present these results. And it comes back to the uncertainty, certainly in what I was presenting, that there are whole layers of behaviour and uncertainty under those results that I didn't present here, that you would want to communicate to policymakers somehow or other. But having said that, I do think that there's immense value in this relatively simple approach, which is why I kept emphasising key processes. That if you isolate those, then you're cutting out a lot of the extraneous detail and uncertainty, while also losing information, of course.
I think it's a great question. My first reaction was I wouldn't present this to a DEFRA or a stakeholder, not in the form that is here. I think yours are closer to, because they look at real things, whereas we're trying to elicit basic processes. So in a sense, from me, it's probably a sentence that I could present, saying that the human behavior is essential in these processes, and I think very similar in this case. And I think they might be seeing this as a truism. I mean, that's the only danger.
Can I ask you, John, what you think convinces stakeholders?
I haven't convinced anybody of anything in my life.
I know you feel.
They're becoming, in the marine sector and fisheries where I know a little bit more, they are becoming more amenable to uncertainty, and I think it's this, but it won't be more than that, and I think it's going to be less than this. So I think the tide is slowly turning, and I think we can express uncertainty in forecasts. And we've seen great examples throughout the last 2 days.
If you're talking to peers, though, what would convince me about a model is evaluation against past trajectories, right? Which is quite difficult to do with these sort of models, I presume.
Well,
yeah, is it not?
not necessarily.
Okay,
good. In an agent-based model like the one we have, there are lots of parameters, lots of degrees of freedom that are quite hard to calibrate. You can fit that model to many different outcomes. You can match reality. The question then is, what's the value of reproducing historical change when you're interested in future change, which might be very different in course and underlying process.
That's interesting. So, and I will go to you in a minute. So does that mean that in the social system we don't think there is a constraint on the future from the past?
No.
Sorry. Let's take this one a little first.
I was actually going to ask something along those lines. So, to what extent do you need to believe the rules, and to what extent they are heuristics, that is a behavior that is observed, and then, so conversely, could you use data and trust them to find better the rules that you're using, and would that be already used?
I think absolutely you need to believe the rules. I'm not sure you can necessarily prove them using existing data, but to a large extent you can, and a lot of the behavioural processes that we think are important we think that because you see them in reality. You know, you see. We've done a couple of studies where you actually, in the data, you see diffusion of information between land managers, and so we put that in the model, and we think that's a key process, even if you can't actually validate that process against any particular data set. I mean, you could in that case.
Could there be hidden rules that maybe
Yeah.
in this
Absolutely, and we have a whole
help discover?
we have a whole range of theories and findings in social science that we tend to ignore completely, but they exist, you know, and we can put those into models. So whether or not we're certain they're operating in particular systems, they're worth looking at.
I think if you consider what the alternative is, I mean, it's just throwing up the hands and saying we can't do anything about the human behavior. I mean, I still believe there is a possibility of describing human behavior with some certainty. But clearly, of course, I mean, you get a Brexit vote and things go in a pear-shape. There is a lot of uncertainties. And the more, it's like anything that involves people is messy. So if we just accept the fact that we're going to have messy results, but try to make sense of those, I think that there is some hope. Or maybe I'm just completely, I might be mistaken here, but.
I think this is good in the absence of anything else. There's a question here.
You mentioned about believing the rules, and in a way that's fundamental for the user having credibility in the output. And in the crafty output that you show the scenario, you've got a situation where Europe was unable to feed itself and had no financial capital, no money, so presumably it couldn't trade its way out of a food shortage, which would imply significant starvation or reduced quality of life. And I wondered, given that you can't calibrate those sorts of European behaviours and outcomes, whether you've presented those sorts of results to stakeholders and they've just gone, well, that's ridiculous, your model is stupid, or have they actually bought into the behaviours and the rules that underpin that sort of extreme scenario?
I'm not sure I claim that people have bought into it, and certainly people have been sceptical about it to the limited extent it's being presented to stakeholders. However, I think there's an interesting parallel with that particular result, looking back in history, where those same capitals perform a very similar reduction, and you do go back to a highly fragmented, dysfunctional land system that didn't produce enough food for everybody. So this is not a validation, but it's a comparison that lends validity of some sort to that simulation, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I've left you out from before. And then we'll come back.
So I'm a little bit surprised we're having this big discussion of socioeconomic systems without any mention of markets and the role they play here. I think you said it really quickly, Callum, you didn't have a market mechanism in there. Is that right?
In the European model, we assume just complete free trade. It's based on a model with a market mechanism.
So prices are responding to supply and demand, and that's not having the rigour of the market holding. Because when you talk to farmers or any landowners, they describe themselves as businesses. So there are these social things going on, but essentially they see themselves as businesses. So they're responding to the market demands out there, the price signals, they're hedging against futures, they're using futures markets, insurance. And these are really crucial things, and their access to capital. These are really crucial things in determining what's going on the land. I think if I was thinking about how I'd think about modelling future, I'd start with that as your basic institution which determines land use. And some of these other things I agree come into it, but that's right at the core of it. Well, how do you think markets should fit into this?
I think the market should be in there, and there's a lot of background to the model that I didn't go into, and it's based on an integrated modelling platform that I think Ian or Mark will mention shortly that has markets in it. So we're sort of going from a prices market framework away to a more behavioural system, and at this stage it is a kind of exploratory toy model to look at these behavioural processes. There are also within...
So your model, I can keep behaving in a way which leads me to be financially in debt, and that doesn't lead to a process in which businesses go under and they get taken over by, like we have in the rest of the economy.
They would go under in that case, yeah.
And be taken over by someone who was profitable.
Yes, with the caveat that profit in the model, in the examples I showed, the setup of the model includes non-economic profit, non-economic values.
Non-financial profit, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Mark.
Sorry, can I just make one very? We do have quite large land uses, land sectors that don't make any profit. I mean, upland sheep farming has major economic, as a business model across Wales. It relies on subsidy to make the business viable. So it's not it's subsidy and market in combination with each other.
Which both financial, you've got to be getting the subsidy or you go under.
Yeah,
Although-
They're both responding to financial signals.
There's another example in upland Scotland with sporting estates that are often privately subsidised by their owners, and in our Scottish implementation of Crafty, we struggle to keep them. They just go because they're not sensible. They're not a rational land use. It requires owners to want them and therefore to subsidise them privately.
Because that's very profitable.
It's often a prestige thing to have a Scottish grass moor.
Mark.
I want to try and respond to one or two of the comments that come up and maybe ask for your views on this as well. So this last thing, I think one of the important issues to raise here is that we don't actually have models, really functional models, well evaluated, that could do the economics, that could do social processes and other behaviours, non-economic behaviours. And until we have those models in place, we can't tell which is, what is the weight of the importance of these different aspects that underpin behaviour. So I think it's critical that we start developing these models in order to do experiments to test exactly the types of things that you're mentioning, Brett. In terms of the past behaviour and how you deal with human dimensions, again, it's really interesting. So I guess in physical models, Peter, your climate models, I guess you pretty much know the laws of physics of clouds, for example. Maybe that's not the best example, but some component.
We know the physics, we can't simulate it on the right scale.
And you can be pretty sure that the physics isn't going to be different in 50 years' time. Yeah. In the human dimensions world, we actually don't know the physics of how human societies function. We've got past experiences, but the past was just one realization of what could have been multiple different pasts. And so therefore we don't know what the basic fundamental laws are of how human societies function. We're trying to get there, and we're trying to build these models to do the experiments that will enable us to take that forward, maybe to try to find some of the generalized rules that do underpin what's going on in these human systems. But the reality is as well, you've got to keep this in mind. You compare, effort that's gone into research in climatology compared to effort that's gone into research into human dimensions modelling. It's just not in the same league by any means at all. It's not even a league for the human dimensions work. It's so under-resourced, and I think and it's not pleading for more research.
So you're agreeing it's just about money?
It's all about money. We just need to do more of this type of work in order to be able to better understand.
Yeah, but so isn't there just so in climate science, the past is not a strong constraint on the future, which is why we get a range of uncertainties, but it does rule out some very unrealistic models. And the same thing would apply with any model, right? Unless you've used all the data for calibration, then you can do a test and you can say to the facts doesn't look like the real world.
Exactly.
And it will rule out. I'm sure you do that. It's just that it doesn't seem that it's often presented that way. Maybe I've missed it, but it's not. Whereas climate science, it's all about we fit the wiggles, and you think we shouldn't really be fitting the wiggles, but you should have the right statistics about the trend. So the variability seems to me is more significant in terms of a metric that's relevant to the resilience of the system, its sensitivity, actually, than the trends, which you can get right in all sorts of ways. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
In this current issue of the London Review of Books, which I have in my bag, there's a wonderful article, and it defines two sorts of people: those who act emotionally, and those who act sort of what you get rationally. So it's a very strange thing, but he puts the southern old people live in the south of England, old in the south of England, combined with the poor in the north of England, and he calls those the humans, and the people who act rationally he calls the econs, and the whole article is about the battle between the humans and the econs as an explanation, quite convincing explanation that when people are, and he says, I forget the author, it's in my bag, but and why don't they behave rationally? And the answer is because they're in pain. So because the poor are in some kind of pain, inverted commas, because they don't have much to live on, and the old who live in the south are in pain because they really are in pain. So such people don't act rationally. You can't expect some people who are their back to the wall necessarily to
Yeah,
act
sorry,
rationally.
maybe I'll ask a question. Did you want to ask them this question?
I think it was a question
Yeah,
for the
I mean,
for the agent.
I'd like to know what rationality means.
Yes, it's a question of what
Um,
it's emotion versus rationality.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, the last. I'm sorry. You have to keep putting your hand up. 'Cause you've got a very short memory.
No, and it's actually related to that
Yeah.
question. I mean, rationality, I mean, I think we all agree that has been maintaining the models because it's easy. And if we open the world of ignoring that rationality in the model, is what else? And then is how people behave. Do they behave, you know, wanting to maintain the status quo? Do they behave by learning, by copying the neighbor? Do they behave with some sort of emotion? Therefore, they give us lots of potential rules for behavior, and it complicated more. I mean, as long as our agents are identical, then we are fine with just one single rule. But if we then in the model incorporate heterogeneity in behavior, then, you know, how far do we go in the complexity and assuming, you know, the diversity of the different behaviors? That's my question. I got another one.
So that question is
can I
about how
answer?
far do you go with complexity? Was that first question?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's do that
Can
one,
I-
next, then we'll come back to it.
Can I answer? So, I mean, comment. Sorry. Well, comment on that is, I think the heterogeneity, at least from a modeling point of view, isn't as bad as repeatability or being consequent in the
Behavior.
in behavior.
It will also change. One day you behave one way and then another day.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like do people react in the same or a similar way to the same cues?
Predictability,
It's
not
predictability rather than.
Yeah.
So in a sense, rationality. I think rationality is stronger here than the predictability.
Yeah.
But it's because I mean, what we're trying to, well, for example, what we've been trying to do in this model is to go beyond. Rationality to me is the maximization of a utility.
Right.
So it's trying to go beyond that by building the irrational elements or bounded rational elements into this. And you can push that as long as you assume that people roughly, that there are rules that have that can predict people's behavior. And they can be stochastic rules, but that we can actually describe this as some sort of Markov process. I think that's.
So you think
Yeah.
you think the social dimension, I guess you do, is predictable even if it's not rational?
I think that we could try to predict it. Whether it is, I
Yeah.
think it's a very different question.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to. There was another. You had another
Only
quick
one
question.
quick one.
Yeah.
Question of the outcomes of the model.
Yeah.
We are looking at social analysis from the people's behavior, but in terms of the outcomes of the models, how far do we go in measuring social outcomes? Like migration, you know, for example, in Chile, there is a lot of subsidies for forest plantation that have led to a lot of poverty because people migrate because suddenly they don't have places to live, it's all forest.
Yeah.
So how far do we go in measuring, as part of the outcome of the model, socioeconomic outcomes like migration, poverty, or
Right. And this
health,
this
for
comes down to
example.
a point that someone made yesterday, a number of people made yesterday, is when we define the system,
Yeah.
it will always be leaky boundaries, and we can do things here that seem to work well here but displace a problem. So about migration, is this embedded in your modelling approach, or could it be?
No.
There are agent-based models focused on Arctic communities, for example, that include migration as one option, one form of adaptation to climate change. So yeah, if the system merits it in some way, then it's possible.
Well,
Yeah, just asking what irrationality is a bit like asking what randomness is. Randomness is just deterministic stuff whose internal processes you don't have access to. So maybe irrationality is just rational stuff whose internal logics we don't have access to.
Yeah.
The point being that perhaps the best way to model irrationality is through probability distributions.
But that assumes that you know that you can actually use that you know what the transition probabilities are, in a sense.
Or you can model the probability distribution through other means like
Sure. Yeah. No. What I mean is that there is that you can actually build a model. Yeah. No. But I think it's a sort of, I mean, maybe I'm just so stochastic oriented that it's a trivial statement to some extent. But you're absolutely right. But I'm not sure. probably I get, when I talk to my economist friends, I'm sure Julia will agree with that. I'm always scolded by saying irrational, because there isn't anything irrational about this. It's more bounded rational or rational in a different sense. And I think that those are better terms because they qualify what we mean by irrationality. But it's moving beyond I mean, to me, basically, it's moving beyond the very simple rules of maximization of a utility.
So there's a question here.
So I really don't like these terms, rational or irrational, any more than I like the previous terms about human and econ. I don't think,
Not mine.
as scientists, we love putting things in little boxes, right? We love to try and categorize things into little boxes, but we know they're not. They're distributions, to echo the Bayesians in the room. There is no irrational or irrational or rational decision making. There is a distribution of decision making. That's it. It's all just probability functions. And so I don't think I don't think the wording's helpful, and I don't think the concept of putting things into little boxes and saying, oh, these people are behaving rationally and these are not, is a sensible thing to do with our model.
So I'm not trying to say that people behave. I shouldn't have used the word irrational here because it says there is something wrong about that, but there isn't. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a whole spectrum. Is the question the word rational has a good definition in economics, and it's what I think both of us were saying is we go beyond that definition. So that in a sense, everything that's beyond this very narrow definition is a different definition to what, I mean, if you ask a person in the street what rational is, they would come up with something different.
Yeah. So was there a question in the middle? Did you have a question?
Well, actually, I've now got another question.
I don't need to know. Just
so I'm very worried that you didn't talk more about the validation of your models. I know you say you put up the questions and say, is the structure of the model appropriate? If it's not appropriate, then one question is, how do we move forward to getting something that is more credible? We've got to be in the business of producing credible models. And I did just wonder whether the old ideas of matching patterns, pattern-oriented modelling that Walker Grimm put up 10 years ago, would that be helpful to move us towards credible models?
Yes, to some extent, I believe so. Depending on which patterns you have in mind, there are what I believe you don't want to do is simply match one pattern, historical pattern, and that's your model validated when you run it into the future and assume it's accurate, because it won't be. The kinds of patterns that models currently miss are spatiotemporal developments of land uses because the processes are inaccurate. And I think a very fundamental validation that we're using is a lot of knowledge in ecology and social science is not in those models, and that knowledge is validated to the extent that it's often empirical or theoretical in social science sometimes, but these are things that we know or believe are very important in those systems that we're not modeling. So a model with those processes is in some sense more valid than a model that neglects them. And having those in your model, yes, absolutely, you then must check, can it match observed patterns in terms of land use outcomes, the structure of land use developments through space and time. But I don't believe there is any single test of validity in the historical validation sense.
Quite convenient, really.
It's convenient. Yes.
Just a follow-up on that.
Sorry, go ahead. There was one here actually, but do you want, is this a follow-up quickly on this one?
It's a follow-up on Richard Sibley's question. What about space for time substitution? I mean, we're working on the assumption that you've got socioeconomic syndromes across different parts of the planet. If you've got a generalizable model, where you can just change the parameters, all right, you build the thing, you see if it works for historical patterns in Central Europe, and then you take the thing and throw it into Southeast Asia, where you think you're on a slightly different development pathway, and you say, all right, here is what we think are the changes of the parameters. Does the model work? I mean, that would give you a little bit more faith about the systematic, have you got the human syndromes? If they're general human behaviors, then you ought to be able to predict them anywhere based on the right parameter space. I know that's really hard, but I think there is a validation and that assumes safe space for time, but I think it will give you a little bit more confidence if you can predict in other socioeconomic systems that you can go into the future. I guess the second point was just a very brief one about continuous variables. I do agree with that point. I think there's a real, that if at all possible, we should try to keep things continuous, because putting things in groups means thresholds, and thresholds causes all kinds of problems in my experience.
Can I just, answer to this? I mean, one problem with with my epidemiologist hat on, I mean, one of the big problems in epidemiology is that firstly, we only have one possibility. I mean, there is an outbreak, and there is just one outbreak. The other one is it's very difficult to test successful control, because we don't know whether things would have happened otherwise. I mean, the fact that, I mean, a good example is the vaccination against swine influenza or avian influenza. I mean, was that program successful? We didn't have an outbreak. But you're absolutely right, and I think it's good that you brought this here. Is the using space or replication in lieu of time. So that's really what I think we're working towards, is being able to predict outbreaks and say about outbreaks, and then you move to another one and another one. It's a program. I mean, I think we're just sort of making small steps, at least on the side that I can talk about.
Yeah, and I would just add, I don't think we're necessarily working towards prediction in land systems. I think that's probably beyond us, theoretically as well as practically. And so that if we could validate in that way, it's not necessarily something that would be key to what we want to do. We want to explore and understand the system far better than we do now. I mean, to take your example of Europe versus Southeast Asia, many of the major determinants of land use change in those regions are political. You know, the Stalin's purges of the peasants and the rise of communism in Southeast Asia, and those are not things we're ever going to be modelling successfully, predicting.
The same thing's true to an extent though with climate modelling, right? We don't model the wiggles because it's a chaotic system. But what we can do is say, well, we get the trend right and we get the variability about the trend right. And it seems to me that variability is the key thing that you're providing with complex models. Well, that plus, and you made a point there, Adam, is that you've got a complex model, you can measure something here, constrain something here, because they're connected in your model. Let's take one last point here.
So just following on the question of validity of those models, and a bit, on what Brett was saying, and these models that you're presenting and crafting, running across the whole Europe, you're linking a economic underpinning model, which is either CGE or PE, but it has equilibrium in there, to a model that is non-equilibrium, and you're getting a result which is far from equilibrium, but you're still somehow those two should work together. So how do you see the way of linking what comes out of those models to fix the assumptions that are invalidated by the PE that you're running?
I think that's a very good question. It's something we're thinking about in trying to formally integrate models that have these different assumptions in them. I'm not sure what the answer is, to be honest. They're different views of the world. I think we see a lot of non-equilibrium dynamics in reality, but of course they are constrained to some extent by markets and so on.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. It's been a really fascinating and energetic discussion. I'm really, really pleased with the way it turned out. So thank you very much to the audience and also to the panel.